Thank you for everyone's patience. Olakut, good morning. Today we're here to share and discuss some very important things. So I will just get to it, and I'd like to introduce Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami's president, Nathan Obed.
Good everyone, good morning, and welcome to this session entitled Indigenous Self-Determination in Research for Better Climate Outcomes. We've got a wonderful panel here today, and I also want to recognize Minister Gebo from Canada, also Minister Churchill from the UK. Thank you so much for spending the time here this morning with us. We also have a number of other elected leaders here in the room, so I want to also recognize all of my colleagues as well. The inclusion of Inuit and Indigenous voices on Science and Innovation Day at COP26 is an integral contribution to the discussions. For Inuit, we face serious social and economic inequities that are being exacerbated by climate change. And the average temperature increase in the Arctic is already twice the global average. Time is running out to transition from carbon and avoid catastrophic outcomes in the Arctic, further underscoring the importance of Inuit and Indigenous leadership in leading climate mitigation and adaptation measures, but also the ongoing conversation about net zero and all actions that humanity can take to reduce our carbon footprint. It's also important to note who I'm here speaking for. I am the president of Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, the national representational organization for Canada's 65,000 Inuit. And our homeland is a third of Canada and over 60% of Canada's coastline. We at ITK created a national Inuit strategy on research and also a national strategy on climate change in the last 3 years. They work hand in hand in many cases, and today is a conversation in relation to research, but also in relation to climate change. We have a deep connection to our lands and waters and have a great interest in all aspects of research involving our people. Too often we have been relegated as spectators in venues such as these, but we're actively working to change that through the self-determination mechanisms that we have through structures such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the constructive arrangements that we have in nation states like Canada, where we have modern treaties or land claim agreements, and we have ongoing conversations with the Canadian government about the participation of Inuit within not only the running of the country, but also in areas such as research. A lot of the work that we do in relation to climate change is in relation to our communities, in relation to our people, and in relation to all living things within our environment. We have a particular focus on being resilient in the face of a changing Arctic, also concerns about our language, our culture, and our way of life in the face of such broad sweeping changes that we already see today. And we have a tremendous need to understand the changing Arctic and understand the way that Inuit are changing in relation to this, whether it's in relation to poverty or food insecurity, whether it's in relation to participation in all climate research. We are finding our way, if you will, and there are many people here today that are on one of these different sides of this particular equation, that all are working together for the betterment of Inuit and Indigenous people across the Circumpolar Arctic. I would like to thank the United Kingdom for hosting this event, but also just end in saying that we have an ambitious new research program that's a partnership between the UK, Polar Knowledge Canada, and Inuit in Canada. It's 20 million over 3 years to work on research priorities that are mutually set, and that Inuit are participants in all of the different research projects from the very beginning, from the creation of the calls for research, then the participation within the research projects. These are the types of steps that we need to take to walk together towards not only a better understanding of the Arctic, but also a respect for those people who live within it. With that, I would like to introduce the Minister of Environment Canada, Stephen Gebo, somebody that I've known now. I met at COP, I believe, in 2015, some years ago. Really thrilled for you to be here and for your new portfolio, and look forward to your remarks.
Ulakut, President Obed, thank you very much. I am truly honored to have this opportunity to share and to learn from your perspective and your research experience. I've been at this climate fight for a long time. So I remember when Indigenous peoples were first given a stage at the United Nations to speak to the world about climate change more than 25 years ago. Indigenous peoples have already been warning us about the changes they were experiencing in the north, how seasons were shifting and nature was becoming unpredictable. But for too long, people were not listened to. Indigenous voices must be heard. Canada's Arctic is warming at 2 to 3 times the global average, and the Inuit clearly shoulder a disproportionate burden of climate change. Climate change not only impacts the way Inuit have lived on the land and sea and ice since time immemorial, it makes worse existing inequalities on things such as human health. Today, we are listening. I'm very happy to see the United Kingdom host of COP26 make this space for this important discussion. That they recognize the importance of the Canada Inuit Nunangat Arctic program, and that with this panel includes so many knowledgeable voices. In Canada, I am proud to be part of a government that believes that Indigenous people must be at the table to make decisions together, including, perhaps especially, during key international events like COP26. And the implementation of the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee is one of these examples. For this reason, Canada partnered with Indigenous leaders to make sure the rights of Indigenous peoples were directly referenced in the text of the Paris Agreement. And today, national Indigenous representatives are included in the Canadian delegation to the UNFCCC and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's not just about working together to map our plans. Canada also recognizes that we should all be working together to implement them. It is crucial that we provide a resilient and adaptive response to the warming climate, And to do so, we require the leadership and knowledge of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples. In short, both Indigenous knowledge and Western science together are essential to properly address the climate challenges we are facing. This is true across government. More comprehensive solutions come from including diverse knowledge systems and from fully arising issues from multiple perspectives. The National Inuit Strategy on Research has been an important part of that. At the same time, inclusion of this knowledge also contributes to better outcomes for Indigenous health, culture, and well-being. These aren't just beliefs. They are principles that we've put into action. Canada is developing tools, approaches, and guidance to support Indigenous self-determination in environmental research. Canada also supports the implementation of the National Inuit Climate Change Strategy, a 4-year climate change strategy by Inuit for Inuit. We are also setting in motion Indigenous research and research training with Indigenous communities through Canada's federal research granting agencies, in keeping with the current strategic plan of the Canada Research Coordinating Committee. The plan for the years 2019 to 2022 identifies new ways of doing research by and with Indigenous communities. It includes strategies that empower First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities to lead their own research, to partner with the broader research community, and to increase accountability of researchers to Indigenous communities. This plan informs the way the Government of Canada designs and delivers research grants, which means its impact will be felt across Canada by all organizations receiving federal funding. And when we look at the long term, through reports such as Climate Science 2050, Advancing Science and Knowledge on Climate Change, we're also supporting the work of the national Indigenous organizations, including Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, to integrate the principles of self-determination in research and equity of knowledge systems. A quarter century after Indigenous people first spoke at the United Nations on climate change, we're still working to fully integrate that vital knowledge into tackling this global crisis. I know there's still a long way to go to get where we should be. I will be your champion because I'm fully committed to continuing the climate fight, and I can't do it without your knowledge and your support. This is why I'm here, to listen to your experiences and your ideas, and to take those with me in my new role as Canada's Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for your participation today. Nakumi.
Nakumik President Obed, and Nakumik Honorable Minister Gebo. I should also probably introduce myself. I started at the beginning, but I wanted to make sure we got things moving. We've been, let's just say, a little bit behind all day. So it's great that we're all here together now. And I'd love for us to turn our attention to the technical experts that we have on our panel. But my name is Carrie Grable. I'm the director of the research department at Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami. The name of the department is Inuit Tapiriit place to learn for and about Inuit. So I've had the great privilege of being the host for today and to moderate this panel and introduce these experts that are next to me. So without further delay, I'd love to introduce Dr. Daly Sambo-Doro. She's the chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council and also affiliation with University of Alaska in Anchorage. So I'd ask if you would be able to share your words with us today. Thank you. Nakumik.
Last minute change. I was going to sit there and deliver comments, but this microphone in my hand is a little uncomfortable. Kuyanak, Uvla Lutuk. Good morning, everyone. Thanks to ITK and also the minister, as well as those at the UK, as well as the Scottish government, in the expressions of support that they have lent to not only Indigenous peoples generally, but Inuit specifically, and this important topic of Indigenous knowledge. First, let me make some quick announcements because we have some good news. For those that don't know, the Inuit Circumpolar Council is an international Indigenous Peoples organization that represents approximately 180,000 Inuit from Chukotka in the Russian Far East throughout Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, and inclusive of those that Natan has described in terms of membership within ITK. Myself, as an Inuk, I'm presently the Arctic Region member of the Facilitative Working Group under the UNFCCC. It's the newest constituted body, which has welcomed Indigenous peoples through its composition. There are 7 Indigenous representatives from the sociocultural regions of the world and 7 state party representatives. And so this is one opportunity for us to lend our voice to discussions within the UNFCCC. In addition, there is a Global Indigenous Peoples Caucus. You'll see many, at least all of the colorful clothing belonging to Indigenous peoples that are walking throughout the pavilion and so forth. But my 2 announcements, of course, is number 1, the Inuit Circumpolar Council is an observer to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I believe we are the only Indigenous peoples organization that has that status. In addition, just yesterday, in the middle of an Indigenous peoples discussion about the significance of Indigenous knowledge, Lisa Koperkulak received an email indicating that we have now provisional membership as an observer to the International Maritime Organization. So this is good news. Yeah. As has already been said, Inuit rely upon the marine environment, and this is a really crucial feature of our cultural integrity and our cultural identity. With the remaining time, I'll dive into just a few comments related to Indigenous knowledge. And I think it's important, as Natan has said, Indigenous knowledge is sourced in the right of self-determination. And I want to draw your attention to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And the preamble of the UN Declaration indicates recognizing that respect for Indigenous knowledge, cultures, and traditional practices contributes to sustainable and equitable development and proper management of the environment. So here within the UNFCCC, these words should resonate with state party members. Article 3 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples affirms our right of self-determination in relation to economic, social, and cultural development. If you think about Indigenous knowledge and how it's rooted in our traditional economies, our cultures, as well as our social development, pretty easy breezy to understand. Article 25 makes specific reference to the profound relationship that we have to our total environment. We've been hearing references to homelands. Well, from our perspective, our total environment is inclusive not only to terra firma and the land, but also the coastal seas and the Arctic Ocean. Our total environment. We've heard a lot about air pollution. Our total environment. I think you get where I'm going with this. More specific to the right of Indigenous peoples to their Indigenous knowledge and their practices and their intellectual property, Article 31 of the UN Declaration explicitly recognizes the important dimensions of Indigenous knowledge. But the second paragraph is really important, and that is that in conjunction with Indigenous peoples, states shall take effective measures to recognize and protect the exercise of these rights. Where is that happening? Certainly it's happening in Canada. We've just now heard from the minister in terms of moving forward with the co-production of knowledge and driving policy decisions related to the environment and many other aspects. So the states are responsive. The government of Canada is responsive. Let's find out about all 192 other state party members that are wandering around these particular halls. What I want to say about the right of self-determination as sourced, the right of self-determination in the context of Indigenous knowledge. This right is sourced in the right of self-determination. It has substantive and procedural aspects. Substantive means that it is something that is important, that is a reality, that it's considerable, that it's significant, that it's an expression of our cultural identity, that it relates to our cultural integrity, it relates to our language, our worldviews, our perspectives. It has substance, it's substantive, but it also has procedural aspects. And by this I mean the official ways or the established ways of doing something, right? So if we're going to pursue, for example, the co-production of knowledge, there has to be a recognition of the substantive nature of the right to our knowledge, as well as the procedural elements of Indigenous knowledge, which goes to the heart of ensuring that the rules, the guidelines, the protocols for engagement of Indigenous knowledge holders and Indigenous knowledge, that it should be consistent with the ways in which we want that knowledge to be engaged. And I was happy to hear that this kind of engagement has to start at the outset, the identification of research priorities, the development in a co-creative fashion of what the questions are, what is the objective, how are we going to arrive at it, who are we going to engage, what's the best way of doing so, especially at the community level. So it's really about the behavior of the research community responding to both the substantive as well as the procedural aspects of our right of self-determination in the area of research. And we have been fortunate to have worked on a number of different projects that represent clearly what Indigenous knowledge is, and also, in fact, we have a definition, but what Indigenous knowledge is, but more significantly, projects that have been accomplished that illustrate how to carry forward the use of Indigenous knowledge, Inuit knowledge within our communities. There's so much more that could be said about this crucial topic, especially in the face of the climate change impacts that we're seeing, and through the facilitative working group as well as the work of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, we've brought forward much of this into this particular and very peculiar UN fora. This fora is so much. I don't know how to say it in a nice way. There's just so much going on. There are a lot of moving parts within the UNFCCC, and we've been trying to make sure that we saturate every part of it with our views and perspectives, and especially the significance of the centuries of accumulated knowledge that we have to offer in order to ultimately ensure that the policy and the decision makers here, the state party members here, have the best available knowledge to base their decisions upon. And when it comes to the Arctic, that means they have to come to us as Inuit. So, qiyanak.
Nakom Daily. Today's discussion, we have Indigenous peoples organizations, we have governments, we have research funding agencies. We're here to talk, to share how we can best work together. And the question that we're really getting to is how do we internationalize and mainstream Indigenous self-determination and research. And so to that end, I'd like to invite Rod Lang. He's the director of the Environment Department in the Nunatsiavut government. The Nunatsiavut region is one of the 4 regions in Canada. So we're very pleased that you've made your way here as well. And I'd invite you to come here if you wherever you prefer. Thanks, Rod.
Thank you. I guess at first I'm just going to give a quick context or background to Nunatsiavut. It's a small region in northern Labrador of about 7,400 people. and it's a self-governing territory, which allows Nunatsiavut Avut to make its own laws over a variety of pieces. One of the key things there that I would like to speak to is how some of the things that have gone on in Nunatsiavut are tied to the National Inuit Climate Change Strategy and the National Inuit Strategy on Research. If you haven't read those documents, I'd strongly encourage you to look at them. These documents are a strategy in themselves, but there's also an implementation plan that goes alongside with them, which are critical because they outlay the steps to get to achieve some of the goals within the strategy. One of the really unique things within Nunatsiavut that is really useful for this is that there's actually a research advisory committee for the Nunatsiavut region, that there's the expectation that anyone wanting to do research in Nunatsiavut or working on something that affects Nunatsiavut were to apply to the research advisory committee to actually get approval to do work in the region. And this is beyond any academic or ethical process tied to an academic institution. This is an additional level that's respecting the Nunatsiavut region, and it's not about shutting projects down. It's about making sure that they're appropriate for Inuit, that you're not duplicating research, and that for data ownership and data access, that you understand what's being done with the data, who owns it, how to access it. There's a reality where there's a lot of data for the Nunatsiavut region that's actually held in southern institutions or in data catalogs that we have to file actual requests to get access to for data for the Nunatsiavut region. So within this process, we actually request from academic researchers or anyone doing research that we have access to the raw data, not for the purposes of writing papers or publishing or scooping someone's story, but so that the data actually remains within the region. Also, something related to this is we have a Nunatsiavut Climate Change Committee that was just recently established that will feed into the National Inuit Climate Change Committee. And through that, we are developing a Nunatsiavut climate change strategy that will feed into the National Inuit Climate Change Strategy. So these pillars will be connected so that you can have that regional specificity, because there's regional differences within Canada when it comes to climate change issues, but there's also regional differences within our own communities. And so, you know, in say a community like Rigolette, some of the climate change concerns might be different than the community of Nain. We've also been really fortunate to, through the hard work actually through ITK and the federal government, achieving some funding that is actually regionally granted so that within the region we can determine how that money is spent or how it works relative to climate change projects. So we have some climate change funding where there's a a regional climate change committee that actually determines what projects are funded and how they're funded. And that's really important to have that regional specificity, but not having it so that it's an academic institution that's controlling the funds, but it's actually there based in the region. And I think something else just that I think it's really important when it comes to climate change and working on green energy projects, there's a large hydroelectric project called Muskrat Falls just upstream from the Nunatsiavut region that is not providing any power to the region, but is actually causing food security impacts through methylmercury and other things. And so even though it's determined for kind of the public good and in reducing greenhouse emissions, it's actually create more food insecurity issues for Inuit. So when we're working to address climate change and research priorities, it's really important that it's not at the expense of Indigenous peoples when we're developing these pieces. So I think that moving forward, it's really important that funding is directed to the regions and to those that are making the decisions, that it's not a group of academics or researchers that are speaking on behalf of Inuit. I think it's really important that funding goes to the regions and that partnerships are developed for research projects and developed with the regions or with Inuit so that the projects actually represent the needs and concerns of Inuit. A lot of times, historically, Inuit have been engaged at the very end of a project and saying, oh, is this right or is this correct? But if you actually involve Inuit in the development of the projects from day one, the project's going to run a lot better, but you're also going to have a lot better outcomes from the project. And then the communication of these results will be a lot better too. So that's really important. And then I guess just lastly, what's I think is also important is just the discussion about knowledge and Inuit knowledge and scientific knowledge, and making sure that it's at an equitable level. Indigenous knowledge is not there to prove that science is correct. They're fundamentally two different knowledge systems, and you can use it to understand something better, but you're not forcing one into the other to try to get the outcomes that match your project or something to that effect. So that's kind of the short notes from me and very regional perspective, but I'm really excited for the panel discussion and questions from the audience here.
Nakomikrad. So we've heard a bit of the circumpolar perspective, a regional perspective, and next I would like to invite the president and CEO of Polar Knowledge Canada, Jennifer Hubbard, to share some remarks from a research and funding agency's perspectives.
Thanks, Carrie. It's an absolute honor to be here today. It wasn't that long ago, it was 2015 in fact, the Canadian government created Polar Knowledge Canada through an act of parliament. It established this organization as Canada's federal agency to strengthen Canadian leadership in polar science and technology, with a mandate to advance knowledge of the Canadian Arctic in order to improve the quality of life of Northerners. Headquartered in Cambridge Bay, Nunavut, a place I call my home today, Polar operates the Canadian High Arctic Research Station and both conducts and funds research, which I believe makes it uniquely placed to provide leadership on how we conduct research and the expectations we set on who will receive federal funding for Arctic research. Since being appointed to the presidency of Polar, my priority has been and will continue to be to build strong, lasting, and meaningful relationships with Indigenous partners rooted in collaboration, respect, integrity, but more importantly in co-development in every aspect of our work. My job is to ensure that as a science-based organization in the Arctic, we serve the priorities and make the space for Indigenous ways of knowing and creating knowledge to lead research to reach climate solutions. This means that non-Indigenous people in leadership are called upon to listen to our Indigenous partners, to truly hear, and to take action to change systems and practices, working towards a future for Arctic research that is led by Indigenous people of the Arctic. For too long now, Arctic research has been led, designed, governed from the south. The National Inuit Strategy on Research calls on Canada and all international partners in Arctic research to ensure that nothing happens in Inuit Nunangat about Inuit without Inuit at the table. Indigenous communities are on the front line of climate change. They are the experts and are leaders as we work collectively towards solutions for a sustainable future. The Canadian government, all governments, have to take decisive action resulting in a paradigm shift in Arctic research where Indigenous science, values, and knowledge guide the research priorities of the North. This year, as President Oved mentioned, Polar partnered with ITK and the UK Research and Innovation to launch and co-develop the Canada Inuit Nunangat United Kingdom Arctic Research Program. This $20 million initiative should be seen as a model for future research programs in the Arctic. And Daly mentioned in her remarks about seeing that Canada is co-developing programs, but we have to remember as we undertook the planning for this program, we were faced with having to address head-on some difficult questions about how governments traditionally fund research and who we fund. Together, we tackled long-held beliefs and practices and disrupted how our agencies have traditionally carried out research. The process challenged us and our governments to examine endemic barriers to Inuit access and control over research and design more equitable processes. It made our respective agencies ask essential, but at times very uncomfortable questions about power and control over research and knowledge production. But in the end, it made us stronger because in order to be successful, we had to listen, learn, redesign together with Inuit at the table, leading. As a non-Indigenous leader, I'm reminded that I need to pause, reflect, listen, and continually ask, what does Indigenous self-determination in research mean to me and my organization? It means Indigenous peoples, Inuit, Métis, have a place at the table, a place of influence where funding decisions are made, when research priorities are established. It means equitable payment for Inuit and Indigenous expertise and knowledge, and a recognition of the value that this knowledge brings to decision-making and decision makers. It means that we honor a distinctions-based approach. It means ensuring Indigenous ownership, access, and control over data collected and knowledge created. It means ensuring that Indigenous youth, Inuit youth, are supported to become the next generation of researchers. We need to step up, show the rest of the world how Indigenous knowledge, Inuit knowledge, and discovery science can converge to propel knowledge and policy for a new generation and create a more sustainable paradigm for understanding our interconnected planet. Indigenous self-determination in research means better climate science. It means better solutions. I call upon those of you who have leadership roles in government on Arctic issues. Dare to be courageous and take the necessary steps to transform Arctic research. Thank you.
Nakomik Jennifer. Lars Bjorn, he's the project manager of the Arctic and Environmental Unit at the Sami Council. Thank you so much for joining our panel, Lars. Looking forward to what you might want to share with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's very nice to be a project manager among all these directors and ministers. So, yeah. I would like to start with a story about a fjord not too far from where I'm from. In the 70s and the 80s, the fish disappeared. And researchers started to ask, why is the fish gone? I don't know who they asked, but they did not ask the local fishermen, because the local fishermen would have said that the industrial fisheries with bottom trawlers removed all the catfish from the fjord. And when the catfish is removed, sea urchin is spreading on the seafloor and eats all the feed for the rest of the fish. And why I'm telling this story is because last year there came a new report saying what happened with the fjords in the 70s and 80s. And it said just the same. Industrial fisheries removed the catfish and the sea urchin started to spread. And why is this story interesting and why is it hitting me? Because it's something about how Indigenous knowledge is being respected as something that's only respected when it's confirmed by Western science. That is not a base for decision making before it's confirmed by someone else, not in the knowledge of itself. And this is a story we see time and time again. And I think we need to turn around. We need to turn around how we look at it. The Indigenous knowledge need to be the basis for decision making. And it's also a question of society. When we have Western research, like research builds society. When we have Western research, we build Western societies. When we have Indigenous research, we build our Indigenous societies. And I think that's just important to note, and I'm thinking that's why we need a self-determination in our research. But the question of, we don't only need a self-determination in the research, because we can research how much we want. We can say, this is our important feeding grounds. But that's not knowledge we want to share with everyone. Because when we tell the state that this is our important feeding grounds, then the state sees, so then that ground is not that important. We can place wind industry on that ground, even though that's not at all what we are saying. But that's how research has been conducted. All research on Indigenous land has been used to see which areas do we not need that much, when in reality we have no grounds to give. So Indigenous self-determination research can't come alone. It also needs to be a part of decision-making, that Indigenous people are part on the floor when decisions are being made. And that's also a question of trust. Will the person who are involved in the research trust that his knowledge will be used in a safe manner, that the researchers and the people researching is doing it for the best of himself? I don't think people will trust if they don't know who is responsible for actually using that knowledge afterhand. And as we know, Western states, or states in general, has done lots of work, or it takes lots of work to build up trust, and it takes quite short time to break down the trust. And the states have unfortunately done quite a lot of work on breaking down that trust, and takes quite some time to build it up. And that's why we need Indigenous peoples in the positions and as the researchers. Thank you.
Nakumik last. Nakumik. Well, I feel proud because we have some time for some questions. So I wanted to invite our audience today. We have probably about 10 minutes or so where we could have a bit of a Q&A period. And I guess we have no mics available to hand out, but I mean, it's a fairly small space. So in the event that, I guess I'll open this up to our experts on the panel if for questions. I know it's always difficult to be the first one to ask a question too, but would anybody like to ask a question? Yes, and if you don't mind introducing yourself, it's always nice to know who's asking a question.
Sure. So my name is Andrew Miller. I'm Chief Scientific Advisor for the Environment, Natural Resources and Agriculture to the Scottish Government. But I also sit as a council member on BBSLC, which is one of the UK's research funding councils. So I was really struck as an advocate of open science that sharing data is one of the things that's come up repeatedly, but that's kind of a procedural issue. I'm interested more in the organizational structure that you're working towards. So it's clear for a researcher like myself who's going to pay me to engage in a process like you're describing. But what organizations do you see as supporting Indigenous participation in research? Who's funding the time of the counterparties from Indigenous people who engage in the research process? Thank you.
Maybe I don't need this. Yeah, okay. Interestingly enough, in an activity of the Facilitated Working Group, Activity 4, which was a series of webinars, we had hoped to hold these gatherings in person with Indigenous knowledge holders from the 7 sociocultural regions, but because of the pandemic, it went virtual. But in the 3rd or the 4th webinar, we invited a person that retired from the National Science Foundation. And as many may know, the National Science Foundation grants millions and millions of dollars to researchers. But the person involved with the social sciences issues, especially in the Arctic region, of her own volition, began requiring that any proposal that was brought forward be inclusive of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge, and to, go back and rewrite the report in order to meet particular standards. As an academic, you have these institutional review boards, right, within the academy, and it's shocking to note how many don't actually have any protocols or guidelines for the use of Indigenous knowledge, the engagement of Indigenous knowledge holders. So there are many, many different opportunities, in my estimation, to adjust the various different mechanisms and regimes, especially the funding ones, to be responsive to the rights that have been outlined at the international level as well as at the national level. And I think that those that want to co-produce knowledge and find ways that end up becoming mutually complementary and beneficial to the Indigenous peoples concerned as well as the researcher and the institutions concerned should begin to ponder this question that you're asking in terms of what is the potential, what are the good faith, ethical, equitable, fair, and just ways forward, as especially by those who control these institutions. I don't know. I feel like I'm stepping your question, but that's my response.
If I can add, the project that the research project that we launched recently with ITK and the UK government is exactly a model to include local communities as part of the project. So one of the barriers that we've traditionally had as a government organization is that we fund a southern researcher who flies in, flies out, and leaves with their data. But there's no reason why, as a federal agency, I can't incorporate that into the funding requirements. I can't say that, unless you collaborate with local Indigenous partners, then you won't get funding from our organization. So those are barriers that, in fact, we have the ability to remove, and we should. And the UK ITK Canada research program is an example of that, where we have required that teams partner with local organization, local communities, Indigenous partners.
I think one more I think one more barrier to add to this is when, for example, young people are going to study research, studying at study institutes. They all have to move away from their own communities. They can't stay at home. They can't stay with their communities and the Indigenous knowledge. We need to have research facilities that actually take care of that lets people stay with their communities while getting an education. And that's an issue that I think lots of Sami youth are feeling right now. Are they going to stay home with their community, or are they actually going to get an education that they can be used in their communities?
Yeah, and just one thing that I'd also like to add, some of the challenges relative to this is related to the eligibility to some of the funding agencies. Right now, the Nunatsiavut government is not eligible for any of the 3 of the major funders in Canada from the Tri-Council. And so a lot of times you have to have an institution then putting in these proposals and then trying to set up MOUs or agreements for that piece. But I think something else that's really important to this discussion is, in terms of funding and other pieces, is a lot of times when there's a review for funding, there's no problem to fund a lot of master's, PhD, and postdoc students, but as soon as there is money for Indigenous knowledge holders or community members, it's really, really scrutinized down to the last dollar. And I think that that's one of those really big challenges when you're actually trying to have an equitable relationship in the development of research. So I think it's just, when it comes to funding, that's really important.
Yeah, that onerous process where you take the ingenuity of people out there and on the ground and shove it into a little square box on a piece of paper. And I've done this. I've gone through National Science Foundation proposals and reams of paper, and it's not quite ever enough. But I think that threshold of institutions themselves making important adjustments, consistent with the second paragraph I read in relation to Article 31, is figure it out, but do so in collaboration and cooperation with the Indigenous peoples concerned.
Another question, I think. Do you mind introducing yourself?
Hello. Yes, there we are. My name is Will Goodon. I'm from Canada. I'm from the Red River Métis, and I'm actually the Minister of Housing. But that being said, I get to do a lot of things, cool things like this. This was an excellent panel, and I have learned a lot. And I want to talk to all of you after, because there's some really good comparables with what's happening in our circles with the Métis Nation. But in particular, one of the things I was wondering about, and maybe ask the folks some questions. Now, this probably doesn't apply to Polar, but there's other research funders like SSHRC in Canada, like NSERC, and there is some serious issues happening for our nation with respect to people who are finding an ancestor from the 1600s who's Indigenous, and they're calling themselves Indigenous now, and they're getting funding from these federal departments, from these federal bodies, up to over hundreds of thousands of dollars that's going to, in my opinion, non-Indigenous people to research and make themselves Indigenous again. So this is an issue I think that's of huge concern for us, but obviously for all Indigenous people, I think that should be a concern.
I just want to respond to that. The other dynamic that we found in the National Science Foundation that has been extremely helpful is is review boards and opening up the review of proposals to Indigenous peoples directly, engaging them directly, and some of that kind of screening and first line questioning about the source of proposals and so forth. This is not to say that they're definitively defining who is Indigenous and who isn't Indigenous, but you have that kind of layer of scrutiny in that regard, because clearly it is an issue.
Hello, my name is Jesus. I come from Spain with the Wall Ocean Network. And my question is, how do you feel about your communities and the indigenous villages having enough resources or funding of opportunities to survive climate change?
We're all in this together, right? I have to say that on behalf of many of our communities, in terms of adaptation and mitigation, we are well beyond the if of climate change. It is, and everybody says when, it's now, right? And so for many of our communities who have experienced substandard infrastructure, we're now, the adverse impacts are being compounded by climate change. So the efforts to adapt and to mitigate require massive amounts of funding. I just want to point you to the Status of Tribes and Climate Change report that, at least for Alaska and the United States, helps to quantify, including the budgets needed for relocation of communities. And to a large extent, if we think about the sources of greenhouse gases and warming, I would call it forced relocation. They don't have a choice. They have to move. So there are insufficient resources, including in the most affluent countries in the world. Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's important to note when we're talking in a Sami context that it's not only to adapt to climate change. We need lots of resources to understand reindeer husbandry, fishery in relation to climate change. We are also facing the issue of climate mitigation in our territories. We have wind industry, forestry, all those industries that are the climate solutions are impacting our lands. So it's not only a question of resources, it's also a question of respecting. And to be adaptable in face of climate change, we need areas to move on. The reindeers need to move to another space when one is frozen, for example. To be adaptable means to have space.
Yeah, and I think, and to your point, I think it's really important to remember that climate change is here. It's not this future thing we're talking about. In Nunatsiavut, Avut, right now, we're 40 days fewer a year for snow days a year, and it's projected that in the next 40 years, that there's going to be a mean air temperature increase of 4 degrees and 6 degrees in the winter for our northernmost community. And so that has huge impacts for people's ability to go out on the land, to harvest, to travel, to practice cultural activities. And to President Zobad's point in his opening is there's already fundamental inequities that exist, food security, housing. So these are all layered on top of that. So those all require resources, and then you're going to need additional resources in addition to this. So there are substantially more resources needed. And I think the strategies have these implementation plans that, if we could get full funding for these kind of things, you would see, allow Inuit to really start to address this.
One quick question, and then if you don't mind being very quick.
Yeah, sorry, I'll try. Elise Belcher, Global Network for Disaster Reduction. I asked this in a kind of realistic manner. The civil society organization I work for supports people who are most at risk from disasters. We have donors that have supported that work and it's been successful. Our donor has come to us and said, can you do work with Indigenous communities? And I respect the fact that you've spoken of control and power issues around your knowledge and respect of that. You commented on whose project and involving people from the project from day one. we don't want to just jump on a bandwagon because a donor has said, hey, it would be great if you can do this. We want to be part of this global solution to tackle climate change, but respectful of your position. As global society groups, when we're offered funding, I think it was a gentleman here, you mentioned about building partnership. How do we best build partnership with groups such as yourselves to maintain that respect, but also receive the mutual benefit of that?
Yeah, I think one of the really most important things to do is actually talk to Inuit in the communities in the region and actually build a relationship, not to come in with an agenda that meets a funder or organization and talk and see if they're even interested in it. And if that's the case, then start to build that relationship and build any potential project. I think a lot of times it's way too late in the process when Inuit are engaged, and then you're in a position where you're trying to fit the square peg into a round hole to meet some other agenda, and it's not actually addressing the needs of the region in the way that would have been done if it had been developed from the beginning.
Yeah. Just quickly to add to that, I think that, we're burdened with so many things, right? Especially leaders, they're burdened with so many things. It's pretty easy to do some social learning and take some responsibility to learn about the communities you're going from, the geography, the political institutions, the communities. Inform yourself, educate yourself way before calling up and saying, who do I talk to? Where do I go? This is something that would really help to alleviate the kind of burden that we get. You should see my inbox in my email account. I'm serious, and there's so much that's now available and out there to lighten the burden in terms of partnership. And just one final comment: I think that Lassie's reference to trust is really important, and building that trust and taking that time. And these are some of the features of the protocols and guidelines: is to recognize Indigenous processes and protocols at the micro level within communities and between individuals, and really it is about behavior and ultimately trust. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for the comments, the experts here. The questions are wonderful. I'd like to invite our final speaker for the session today, Minister Jo Churchill. She's the Minister of Agri Innovation and Climate Adaptation here in the UK. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, firstly, I'd like to thank ITK for hosting this event, but mostly I would like to thank our distinguished panelists. I listened to Dali, Rod, Jennifer, and Lassie's, and I do hope I've pronounced those correctly, contributions, and they were amongst the most thought-provoking that I've had at my time here in COP. So, we've known for a long time that Indigenous communities are on the front line of climate change. Now, with the Arctic warming 3 times faster than the rest of the world, especially true in northern Canada and particularly across the Inuit Nanangat, the stats that Natan laid out at the beginning said it all. So it's right, it's time that vital research to understand and adapt to these changes is developed in full and equal partnership between researchers who travel to the Arctic and the researchers and communities who live there. Finding new ways to design projects and respect voices is what I heard loud and clear through this morning's presentation. The Canada Inuit Nanangat United Kingdom Arctic Research Programme, launched in June, that Jennifer referred to, and running until 2025, is a big step in doing exactly this. But keep checking in, keep checking that that's what we're doing is good, because it's only when we do good that we can design for others to follow. Developed in full and formal partnership between the funding partners in the UK, Canada, and ITK. We need the expert researchers from the Inuit communities to be absolutely equal partners in the design, the proposal development, the assessment, the funding decisions, the project delivery, and that data ownership. We want to champion this new approach where we can. There's much here for research funders, researchers, academics, and Indigenous people groups to take away. They are stewards of 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. Indigenous peoples are leaders in how to develop nature-based resilient and effective solutions to climate change. Their knowledge and innovations, technologies, also spiritual values, should involve all of us from the beginning. That knowledge and expertise complements and enhances environmental science, engineering, other research, and innovation at all scales. And in line with the Paris Agreement decision text, when taking action to address climate change, the rights of Indigenous people and local communities should be respected, promoted, and considered. But they should be more than words on a page. So I call on all governments and their research funding agencies to prioritize relationships and collaboration with Indigenous communities, and to respect the right to self-determination when designing and funding new programs, and to make this part of collaborative, international, and solutions-focused approaches to science for climate change. In the run-up to COP, on the UK's new polar research vessel, the Sir David Attenborough, quite an awesome research vessel, if you get a chance to see it. Patrick Vallance, the UK's government's chief scientific advisor, launched a statement from science advisors from around the world, calling on their governments to support science and innovation for the 1.5 temperature goal. It called on governments to develop ambitious scientific and evidence-based long-term strategies, increase international collaboration to accelerate research, development, demonstration, and deployment of effective mitigation and adaptation solutions, to establish programs to strengthen global research and innovation capacity. Let's ensure that those research and innovation efforts take place in a way consistent with self-determination of Indigenous people around the world. The word I wrote down at this point during the discussion was trust. So Lassie, I think you made your point. Because as the COP26 presidency recognizes in its collaboration goal, effective climate action requires an inclusive and all-of-society approach. And maybe not segueing things into the way we've always done things, but taking this as our chance to do things differently. By coincidence, the deadline for applications to the Canada Inuit Nanangat United Kingdom Arctic Research Programme is tomorrow. Quite short to write a proposal between now and then, but just saying. So I really look forward to hearing about the successful projects in this groundbreaking initiative, seeing how this and other important partnerships develop and are replicated and advanced in other regions of the world. Let's do this together.
Nakumik, Mr. Churchill. What a joy, what a pleasure. I really appreciate everyone's attention, expertise, sharing, talking, trusting, believing, so everything. I know we're way past time. Sorry, Helen. But a major shout out to inviting us to come here, to be here today. So thank you so much. So I hope everybody has a nice day. Bye.